This is Lowell Thomas speaking, flashing to you the news of the world, pictured by Fox Movie Tone.
He wasn't particularly handsome by the standards of Hollywood. He wasn't particularly strong or healthy or destined to great things. And look where he went and what he did.
His adventuresome spirit, his love of life, his optimistic view of the world. I think that more than anything is really what made him such a success in so many different fields throughout his life.
I don't know how he did it. Traveling around the world 5 times in 1 year. You know, who has the stamina to do that?
Over the course of his illustrious career, Lowell Thomas was an adventurer, a showman, the most familiar voice in radio, a television personality, and a media pioneer. He was one of the first to be called a newscaster. But through it all, one thing always was true about Lowell Thomas. He was a supreme storyteller.
He was always very interested in what other people were doing, especially those that were doing unusual, novel things and succeeding at it.
When he showed up, the story became important. If he decided it was important, it became important to the world.
He kept the same freshness all the way to the end and the same excitement. And I think it's because he was a storyteller. And you never tire when you're a good storyteller.
Good evening, everybody. This is Lowell Thomas.
In April of 1917, America reluctantly entered World War I. To bolster public opinion about the war, the U.S. government sent a 25-year-old reporter named Lowell Thomas to bring back positive images and stories of American soldiers and their allies. The resourceful Thomas had borrowed heavily to finance his project, and he needed to find gripping stories for it to work.
The ability for a 25-year-old to come up with $100,000 on his word alone, virtually. That's quite a feat for anybody to pull off.
But Thomas felt that the blood and guts of trench warfare in France would be too intense to inspire support back home. So he and his cameraman pressed on to Jerusalem, where they recorded the British military's peaceful takeover of the Holy City. But parades alone were not what Thomas was looking for, and he kept an ear to the ground for something more compelling. Then he heard rumors about a mysterious British officer who was leading the Arabs in a revolt against the Turks. This had all the elements of a great story, and it also had the potential to make his money back. In the old city of Jerusalem, Thomas was trying to track down his elusive subject when a group of Arabs approached and passed him by.
And he noticed this fellow walking down the street, obviously an Englishman or a Westerner, slightly built, wearing Arab costume, and he asked, "Who the heck is that?" It's just one of those things that just dropped into his hands.
That afternoon, Thomas met Colonel T.E. Lawrence, introduced as the uncrowned king of Arabia. Moments later, Colonel Lawrence posed for Thomas's camera on a balcony above a busy Jerusalem street. It was Thomas's first photograph of a man who would become a household name and help to launch Thomas's career. Thomas and his crew followed Colonel Lawrence as he executed a brilliant sneak attack on the port city of Aqaba. They exposed hundreds of lantern slides, large glass plates, and captured rare moving images with a hand-cranked movie camera.
And they were the only ones who got the pictures and got the footage. And it's a fantastic story in terms of how that could have even happened, how that could have been possible.
Now Thomas had some exclusive material. But just when they were on their way home, the armistice was announced on November 11, 1918. The war was over. Americans no longer needed to be sold on the war effort, but Thomas still had to turn his material into some kind of money-making production. He had already spent his backers $100,000.
So he had a huge bill, tons of footage that was pretty much a white elephant, and he better find a good idea to put them to use, do something, anything with them.
As it turned out, Thomas's timing was perfect. He returned to New York to find that Orientalism was all the rage, and that his exotic story was just the ticket that the public was looking for. Out of their material, he created a multimedia live show and dubbed its new star Lawrence of Arabia. Three arc lamp projectors brilliantly illuminated the screen, eliciting gasps of awe and wonder from the filled to capacity audiences. And Thomas narrated each show live.
He created something that was quite new, and we also have to remember that there was no such thing as National Geographic with lavish color photos, so the pictures, to begin with, would have been pretty startling. And he put some music, and he had some perfume wafting across the stage, and his wife, even one night, had to just do the Arabic dancer, and it was really just done ad hoc, and it was extremely successful. And then every single night, the one thing that carried the story was his voice.
This is Lowell Thomas inviting you to come on an epic journey such as no man ever made.
Thomas's resonant speaking voice and his ability to tell a good story were two talents that he had picked up long before he ever left for the Middle East. As a young boy growing up in a Colorado mining town, Lowell Thomas encountered many colorful characters.
We ran into some pretty interesting people who came to mine, guys who had been mining elsewhere in the world and brought these tall stories about what life was like, you know, in Australia or whatever it might be. And it was an eye-opener to my father. And he always felt that that's where he got his first interest in travel, in looking at the rest of the world.
Lowell's father encouraged him to practice public speaking, and he was better at it than anyone else in his school.
Suddenly, my father discovered that he was so good at it, and he spoke so well in reciting poetry and things, that they named him captain of the football team. Now, I can't see any relation between the two at all, none whatsoever.
Lowell Thomas, I think, trusted his voice. His father gave him a very big gift. From day one, he just made him very, very good at that one thing. He gave him that voice talent as his ticket to life.
Thomas's voice would eventually take him around the world many times over. And now, it packed the house of the Lawrence of Arabia show for 8 straight weeks, and the press raved. It was such a hit that he took it on to London, where they played the biggest theaters.
Everybody went. I mean, they stood in lines for hours to get tickets to these things. The number they did was even amazing. They would do doubles on all the weekends, and they'd pack every one of those.
But the show did more than sell tickets alone. It also shined a spotlight on Colonel Lawrence's fight for Arab independence in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Thomas rode fame and fortune all the way to the bank, earning more from his New York and London engagements than he ever imagined. In 1920, Lowell and Fran, his wife of 3 years, took the production on the road. Over the next 2 years, they toured Australia, Malaya, Burma, India, and Afghanistan, collecting new material as they went.
Every time he was visiting a different country or a different culture, he was out working for his next presentation. He was always looking ahead, always looking for new angles and new approaches to things.
Always the trooper, Fran followed Lowell to the ends of the earth.
She literally in the travels participated. It wasn't like drop me off at the hotel while you go visit with the headhunters. It was a life for a woman that she probably would not have been able to experience otherwise. So she had to have had much of the adventure in her as well.
But adventure travel didn't come cheap. And even though he had created one of the hottest media sensations the world had ever known, by the time he returned to New York, Thomas was almost broke.
He did it because he loved what he was doing, he loved people, he loved to learn about the world, and money, when he had a lot of it or when he didn't, was just a byproduct of his first love.
He wasn't frugal. I don't think you could ever use that word. Yeah, Dad made a lot and he spent a lot, put it into new ventures, and some of them succeeded.
The 32-year-old Thomas looked for a way to exploit the stories that he had collected on his world travels. He returned to what had put him on the map in the first place and wrote a best-selling book about Lawrence of Arabia. Then, Doubleday Publishing gave him a large advance for more books based upon his adventures.
They are settings in exotic places, but they're very much character books too. They're very focused on and interested in people and what people do in these places. They are not travel literature. They are driven by story.
On his book deal alone, Thomas was able to settle into a comfortable farmhouse with Fran and their new son, Lowell Jr. And it wasn't long before he would find himself at the forefront of yet another storytelling venture. By 1930, radio had evolved as the most popular form of new media. William Paley, head of a fledgling radio network called CBS, was looking for a newscaster, and Thomas's talents were a perfect fit.
Somebody says, well, this Thomas character, I've heard him speak. Why don't we ask him? And so Paley calls him and he says, well, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, I don't care. Talk for 15 minutes. And Thomas does. And they simply hired him right on the spot.
This was Empire Day for our neighbors across the international boundary.
Thomas thought the job would only last a year, but he was so good at what he did, his velvet voice effortlessly bringing the news to life through human interest stories, that his radio career would last more than 45 years on several networks.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight's communique just in from Invasion Headquarters summarizes the news of all the successful landings. Allied forces, it says, have succeeded in their initial landings in France, and fighting continues. The communique...
There's no question that Lowell Thomas was made for radio, and radio was made for Lowell Thomas. He was a perfect storyteller. He had a great commanding voice, and he used it well. He wrote well. He was one of the most popular people on radio in those days.
And another bulletin just in.
Many Americans grew up listening to Thomas every evening, year in and year out.
I remember my father used to say, well, people are usually listening to him just as they're about to sit down to dinner. He would say, my job is to convert written English into spoken English.
Oftentimes the radio was the only means of communication, so you had to really tell the whole picture there. You had to paint a picture for your audience, not only about the news events, but the settings in which those events were taking place.
Thomas talked the nation through some of its toughest times, including the Depression, Prohibition, and the Great Dust Bowl. But no matter how seriously Thomas took his broadcast responsibilities, nothing could stop him from occasionally losing his poise at a humorous story.
Phil Harris, the band leader, she explains that working so hard all day in the film studio, she is sometimes not in such perfectly good humor. she snaps at me, which is all wrong.
He was capable of being self-deprecating. He didn't take himself too seriously. That made him a wonderful radio speaker.
As a measure of his popularity, Western Union once offered a free telegram to any listener who wanted to send Lowell Thomas a wire.
And they thought they were going to get, hundreds, maybe 1,000. and they got 265,000. Proving not only that they listened to, the radio, but they listened to Thomas.
Then, in 1932, the now famous voice got a face when Thomas became the on-screen host of the popular Fox Movietone news series.
Lowell Thomas speaking, flashing to you the news of the world, pictured by Fox Movietone.
Before television, people got their news from newspapers, radio, or weekly newsreels shown in movie theaters.
Story of terror and destruction. Towns and farms laid waste by the savage power of storm-driven water, houses swept away, buildings broken up like matchsticks, human beings imperiled and miraculous escapes, and human beings who did not escape.
The newsreel stuff was pretty tough because he had to do that twice a week during the middle of the night. He would work from like midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning to get the news out in time.
But when America entered World War II and Hitler's army threatened to consume all of Europe, Thomas's style of human interest storytelling wasn't enough to satisfy audiences who wanted more in-depth reporting and hard news.
This is Ed Murrow speaking. In this, my first commentary for a British newsreel, I have been invited to tell you something of the land and sea invasion of Iwo Jima.
Edward R. Murrow ushered in a new era of broadcasting, assembling a news staff not because of their voices, but because of their knowledge of the battlefields of Europe.
They had a different audience in a sense. Murrow was a newsman. The story of that day, he told you. But Lowell Thomas was not primarily a journalist in the sense of the day's news. Thomas was a storyteller who was an adventure story man. They were vastly different approaches.
While Lowell Thomas would continue to do the news until the late 1970s, by the end of World War II, it was clear that others would be moving to the forefront of a medium that Thomas had pioneered. After the war, Lowell Thomas was presented with an opportunity that would breathe new life into his career and allow him to return to what he loved best, the outdoor world of adventure travel.
Lowell Thomas Jr., Care American Embassy, Tehran, Iran.
And out of the blue comes a telegram from my father saying, "The miracle has happened. We've got permission to go to Tibet. Meet me in Calcutta."
In 1949, the 56-year-old Thomas and his son Lowell Jr., then 26 and himself an accomplished filmmaker, were invited to visit the Forbidden Kingdom of Tibet. Only a handful of outsiders had ever been allowed in.
Boy, I just dropped what I was doing as fast as I could and hurried on to Calcutta, started organizing, our caravan and all the food we would need and so forth. Because it was a major expedition. And we had mules and donkeys and ponies that we rode on ourselves. It took us 24 days to travel, I think, roughly 300 miles through the Himalayas, across the Great Plateaus to Lhasa. Believe it or not, we used handheld magazine loading 16mm cameras. Very low-tech equipment. In fact, I never even used a tripod. Although it's a little bit amateurish, the story was so important that it didn't matter. That we didn't have zoom in and zoom out and perfect lighting every time. The story carried the day.
As they emerged from the last high mountain pass, the Thomases got their first view of Lhasa, the capital, and home of the Dalai Lama and thousands of Buddhist monks. Soon after arriving, the Thomases realized just why they had been invited in.
And only when we were there and talking to their ministers did we learn that they were very fearful of the Chinese invasion that was about to come and desperately wanted the Western world to know about this coming invasion and hoping that we could help to persuade the Chinese not to do it.
The Chinese considered Tibet as part of China and were determined to overthrow the Tibetan government. After several days, the Thomases were invited to the Summer Palace to meet Tibet's leader, the 14-year-old Dalai Lama, believed to be the reincarnation of the Buddha of Compassion.
It was a very thrilling moment, you know, to enter the Summer Palace with the incense in the air and monks chanting and thundering horns on the roof, and follow around a group of pilgrims and finally get His Holiness's blessing. And he was sitting up, you know, on his little throne wearing his golden peak cap, and he looked down and smiled at us and really looked very curious.
Thomas understood that they were witnessing a culture that didn't have long to live.
This is a case where his talent for the human story went beyond what others might have done. He took the time to photograph just everything, even the mundane, and the everyday life, and the kitchen, and the cooking, and the monks relaxing. I don't think anyone else would have been able to document this the way he did.
Then, on the return trip out of Tibet, Thomas's career as a world traveler almost came to a sudden and tragic end.
On the way out, the evil spirits caught up with my father, I guess. He was thrown off his horse and broke his leg very seriously, just beneath the hip. And we didn't have any medical kit to speak of. That was one mistake we made. We should have had more medical equipment with us. And so we had to carry him all the way back out of Tibet. And that took a long time. But my dad was very tough.
A month later, the team emerged from Tibet, and Thomas's leg was rebroken and properly set. Never missing an opportunity, Thomas recounted their story for the cameras.
Recently, we had a little misadventure in Central Asia, an argument with a horse, and the horse won. We've been away from America many times before, but when we flew over this continent today, it seemed marvelous to get home more so than ever before.
The completed Tibet film would introduce Western audiences to that country's plight, but it was too late. Before it was even released, Chinese troops invaded in October of 1950, eventually toppling the Tibetan government and forcing the Dalai Lama to flee. By the late 1950s, Americans were turning to their televisions for news and entertainment, and Lowell Thomas had no trouble adapting to the new medium.
I am Lowell Thomas. We live amid the greatest abundance of information any people has ever had.
When he hosted a new series called High Adventure, he again turned to his signature style with the human touch.
My name is Sinbad, Sinbad the Sailor. Here in the Persian Gulf, we are surrounded by magic names that fair tingle with romance. There's Trebizond and Far Yarkand, Rangoon and Singapore. There's Timbuktu and Samarkand, Baghdad and Tehran.
It had been more than 30 years since he created a multimedia sensation with Lawrence of Arabia. And now he was inventing yet another media hybrid, something that we would later call infotainment.
I've just come in from a meeting of scientists, something a little unusual for me.
What is interesting, of course, is that at the time he did it, I don't think he was conscious of shaping journalism in a particular way. He went back to what he knew how to do well. He went back to the funny travelogue and the human interest story.
Who am I? Well, through these cracked lips, and with my voice reverberating down here in this small crack in the ice, I'm not quite sure myself. Maybe I am Emmett Kelly, your circus jester.
High Adventure only lasted for 11 episodes, but it proved that Thomas could still tell a good tale and could travel to the ends of the earth to get it. Over the next 20 years, Thomas launched Cinerama and other new broadcast enterprises. He became a media mogul and enjoyed his well-earned position as one of America's most revered broadcasters.
From Salisbury, Rhodesia, from Moscow, and from Islamabad, Pakistan comes today's news.
He hated the word retirement. Oh, he really did. He said, oh, no, I'll never retire. That was his attitude.
He has the same tone and the same excitement when he's 80 years old as when he was 17 or 20. You see a freshness that has absolutely not changed. For instance, he had another trip. He was getting ready to go to the Middle East, and he had no doubt that there was something there for Lowell Thomas and his way of telling stories that was worth going again to, and he was going to go and try to find a story.
On August 29, 1981, planning for this next adventure, Lowell Thomas died peacefully at his home. He was 89 years old.
What Lowell Thomas did with those travel stories, all of them, from the beginning, the travelogues and the Lawrence stories, all the way to the High Adventure, was to take people to places that they probably would not go to. The added value of Thomas's magic, if you wish, is that it's sort of, even if you have been to the place he has visited, to reinvent it and make it bigger than it was, and you enjoy it all over again with a little spice of adventure, a spice of fun, a spice of imagination, which is Lowell Thomas's gift to the travel experience.
Upon his death, Lowell Thomas was honored by fellow newsman Walter Cronkite.
Thomas himself recalled, over the years, I have had only two absolute rules on the air. The first is not to confuse opinions with hard news or to be drawn into taking sides. My second role has been to remember always that the disembodied voice behind the dial comes from a human being.
Instead of my usual so long until tomorrow, or rather so long until Monday, because this is Friday, tonight it will simply be, here's to all of you, and so long.